Before the world ever heard about the 17 minutes that shattered an empire, the fate of the Holy Land was already being written slowly, painfully across 7 days of torment that should have broken any army on earth. Men don't simply survive the desert. They endure it, bleed in it, and become creatures shaped by suffering. And in the first week of September, 1191, Richard the Lionheart turned that suffering into a weapon sharper than any blade. But to understand how 12,000 Crusaders, half-starved, half-dead, blistered by heat, pierced by arrows would soon obliterate 30,000 of Saladin's finest warriors, you must first understand the march that nearly killed them. The battle at Arsuf didn't begin on the morning of September 7th. It began 7 days earlier. The moment Richard lifted the cross above Acre's shattered walls and made a decision that both commanders believed they had predicted perfectly. They were both wrong. Richard had just taken Acre after a 2-year siege that drained the life out of thousands. The air still reeked of rot, smoke, and broken humanity. Yet the crusade could not pause. Jerusalem glittering, sacred, agonizingly close-weighted to the south. The question was simple. Which path would the Lionheart choose? March inland across open plains, risking ambushes far from supply lines, or hug the Mediterranean coast, letting the navy shadow them with food, water, and medicine? Richard chose the coast, the safe route, the predictable route. And hundreds of miles away in the hills of Samaria, Saladin smiled, because predictability is the seed of destruction. The coastal road from Acre to Jaffa was a death corridor, 80 miles of narrow passage, with the sea trapping the Crusaders on one side and rolling hills on the other. For light cavalry, archers, and mobile forces, it was paradise. For heavily armored knights carrying 40 pounds of chainmail in blistering heat, it was a slow-motion execution. And Saladin, whose entire strategic doctrine revolved around mobility, harassment, and attrition, knew that the corridor would allow him to bleed Richard's army dry long before reaching Jaffa. Yet what the Sultan didn't expect was that Richard knew this too. For years, each commander had studied the other like a scholar poring over sacred texts. Richard analyzed every Frankish defeat at Saladin's hands, especially Hattin, the catastrophe that destroyed the Crusader kingdom 4 years earlier. Saladin interrogated captured Crusaders about Richard's tactics in Europe. Their reputations weren't exaggerations. These were two of the greatest military minds of the medieval world, and each believed he understood the other better than anyone alive, which meant that the march was more than a journey. It was a chess match, a duel of patience, a test of will. The armies they led reflected their philosophies. Richard's force was small, just 12,000, but forged like a blade. At its heart, 2,000 knights, the armored giants of the medieval battlefield, 300 Hospitallers at the vanguard, grim, disciplined warrior monks, 300 Templars at the rear, equally feared, equally disciplined. The remaining knights came from England, France, and Normandy, each encased in steel, each a fortress on horseback. Behind them marched 10,000 infantry, carrying shields, spears, and crossbows capable of punching through armor at 200 yards. But their greatest weapon was not steel. It was discipline, something Richard had drilled into them endlessly, a formation that moved not like 12,000 men, but like a single living organism. Saladin's host was the opposite, fluid, fast, and deadly. 10,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry, trained from childhood, 20,000 light horsemen, Bedouin scouts, Turkish archers, Kurdish infantry, 3 or 4 horses per rider. Tactics built around speed and precision, psychological warfare, drums, cymbals, dust screens, and an endless rain of arrows designed to torment, not annihilate. Saladin didn't want to destroy the Crusader army immediately. He wanted to crack it open, break its discipline, force a reckless charge, then kill it. And so the march south began. Day 1, the first whispers of death on September 3rd. The heat rose like a living creature. The Crusader column stretched along the narrow road, the sea shimmering to their right, the hills on their left crawling with shadows. The first arrows were not meant to kill. They were meant to irritate, to whisper, "We are watching. We are waiting." Horse archers appeared on ridgelines like blackbirds, releasing arrows that fell in a steady, maddening drizzle. The Crusaders responded with nothing. Richard forbade it. No charging, no breaking formation. Crossbowmen fired only when protected. The knights, who were born to attack, were forced to become shields. It was agony. Day 2, the pressure tightens. The second day brought escalation. More arrows, closer harassment. bolder cavalry sweeps. A Hospitaller knight took an arrow through the eye-slit of his helm. Another's horse collapsed beneath him, screaming. Every Crusader who died did so without swinging a sword. It defied every instinct they possessed. Richard rode along the line, his voice steady. Hold, hold. None of you will charge until the signal. 3 trumpet blasts. That was the rule. Any knight who charged early would be executed. Evan nobles. Discipline was no longer a virtue, it was survival. Day 3 to 4, the desert turns against them. The sun became an enemy, more dangerous than any sword. Temperatures soared past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Armor turned into furnaces. Men marched with cracked lips, bleeding heels, swollen tongues. Water was rationed. Some fainted. Others marched with arrows sticking from their shields like quills on a tortured animal. Muslim historians recorded losing over 400,000 arrows in 3 days. The Crusaders lost dozens. Saladin lost hundreds. But the psychological toll was immeasurable. This was torment by design. Day 5, humiliation and fury. Saladin escalated again. He ordered coordinated attacks on the rear guard, the Templars. These elite warriors were forced to ride backwards in their saddles, shields raised, horses led by squires. It was brilliant but humiliating. A tactical mockery that spread anger like wildfire through the ranks. Some young knights broke discipline. They charged. Every one of them died, and their screams carried across the column like warnings from the future. Day 6, the breaking point. The Hospitallers at the front, the vanguard, were near collapse. Every man was wounded. Horses were dying. Arrows protruded from shields like macabre decorations. Reports reached the Hospitaller master, Garnier de Nablus. The men can endure no more. Richard responded with cold genius. He rotated the line. Fresh knights moved to the front. The wounded were pulled inward. Crossbowmen redistributed their limited bolts. But he did not accelerate the march. He would not give Saladin the running battle he wanted. The army moved just 6 miles that day. 6 miles of suffering, 6 miles closer to the trap. Night of day 6, the chess match revealed. That night, the Crusader camp simmered with dread. Men whispered prayers. Horses shook from fatigue. The drums of Saladin's army throbbed in the distance. Richard gathered his commanders. He was exhausted, half-burnt by sun and fear, but his voice held iron. Tomorrow, he said, Saladin will commit everything. He must. It is his last chance. There was no bravado, no swagger, only certainty. And a question historians still ask, did Richard plan this all along? Did he slow the march on purpose? Did he want Saladin to overcommit? By dawn, the answer would become clear. The storm was coming, and Richard had been waiting for it. Dawn broke on the 6th day with crimson light bleeding across the horizon, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. The air was still, thick, unnervingly quiet, almost reverent, as though the world were holding its breath. But in the hills to the east, the Muslim host was already awake, already waiting, already tightening the noose around Richard's exhausted column. Every man on both sides knew it. This day would not end like the others. But the true escalation had begun long before that sunrise. Day 2 to 3, the desert tightens its grip by the 3rd morning. Even the veterans men who had fought in Sicily, Cyprus, the siege of Acre felt fear gnawing at them. The harassment never stopped. Arrows hissed from every direction, stitching the air with an endless, nerve-shredding rhythm. There were no grand volleys, no dramatic charges, just an unceasing drizzle that made sleep impossible and awareness eternal. Every few minutes, a man would jerk, grunt, collapse. A shield would rattle from a sudden impact. A horse would scream a sound that seemed to echo longer than human voices. The desert heat compounded the agony. Armor burned skin. Sweat evaporated before it formed. Some infantry marched with tongues swollen so badly they couldn't speak. Richard's strict discipline kept them alive, but at a terrible emotional cost. Hold the line, do not charge, endure the arrows, endure the drums, endure everything. The psychological warfare was deliberate and brutal. Saladin's archers used the hills as a stage. Sometimes they rode close, almost tauntingly, waving their sabers, calling out insults in Arabic words. The Crusaders didn't understand but felt all too clearly. Other times, they'd vanish into the dust, only to reappear at a different angle, loosing arrows like phantoms. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from fighting an enemy you cannot reach. It was the fear of impotence, of anger turned inward. It is a pressure that can drive any army, no matter how elite, to break. And that was exactly what Saladin wanted. Day 4, the heat that kills. By the 4th day, the desert transformed from tormentor to executioner. Temperatures soared above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The Crusaders marched with armor so hot it blistered the skin beneath. Templars and Hospitallers hardened to pain, no longer struggled with anger, they struggled with consciousness. Many fainted, only to be kicked back onto their feet by sergeants who knew a man who fell behind was a man already dead. Even the horses were faltering. War horses destrious, bred for battle, not endurance. They panted, they stumbled. Some dropped mid-step, legs folding like collapsing pillars. A Templar chronicler later wrote, "We walked, not as men of war, but as dying shadows clinging to purpose." Day 5, humiliation, rage, collapse. On the 5th day, Saladin stopped merely testing the column and began actively trying to snap it. He ordered coordinated pressure on the rear guard. The Templars, proud, fierce, unyielding, were now forced to ride backwards in their saddles, shields raised, presenting a moving wall against the relentless arrows. They could not turn, could not countercharge, could not relieve their rage through violence. Their horses were led by squires like pack animals. It was brilliant tactics. It was also deeply humiliating. Templars were men who had sworn never to retreat, but now they appeared as if they were doing nothing but retreating. The psychological damage was severe. Younger knights began whispering mutinously. Some clenched their reins with white knuckles. A few began to cry not from fear, but from helpless fury. And then it happened. A handful of knights snapped. 3 to 5 sources differ. They lowered their lances and charged. It didn't get 50 paces before Muslim horse archers encircled them like a tightening storm. Their horses collapsed under arrow fire. Their armor became cages. They were hacked down, isolated, screaming, each one dying without support, without purpose. Their deaths were like sparks cast into a powder keg. The entire vanguard trembled with the urge to break ranks and avenge them. Only Richard's presence, riding constantly along the line, sweat-soaked, unblinking, kept the army from disintegrating. Day 6, the breaking point. By now, even the Hospitallers, who prided themselves on discipline beyond even the Templars, were reaching their limits. The vanguard was bleeding men and horses at an unsustainable pace. Their armor was dented, their banners frayed, their arms tired from raising shields for hours on end. Garnier de Nablus, the Hospitaller master, surveyed his men and felt despair for the first time in years. Every knight bore wounds, every horse limped or bled. Some held shields so riddled with arrows they resembled wooden porcupines. The reports reached Richard quickly. The Hospitallers cannot endure another day. But Richard's response was not to speed the march, not to allow a charge, not to change the plan at all. Instead, he ordered the line rotated with mathematical precision. Fresh knights moved to the front. The wounded were pulled tight into the center. Crossbowmen redistributed their dwindling bolts. Infantry tightened the formation like a breathing iron fortress. Richard understood something no one else could see yet. Saladin's strategy was working too well. The Crusaders were being pushed to the brink, which meant Saladin believed a final push would finish them. Exactly what Richard wanted. That night, the Lionheart's final gambit, on the night of September 6th, the Crusader camp looked like a graveyard of shadows. Men lay where they fell. Some prayed. Others simply stared blankly at the sea, wondering if they would ever see home again. Across the plains, the Muslim army lit countless torches, thousands of small, flickering stars of death circling the Crusaders. The drums never stopped. The cymbals clattered like bones. The air thrummed with an unspoken promise of murder. Richard summoned his commanders. When he entered the tent, even the torches seemed to dim. He looked like a man carved from exhaustion, dust-caked armor, cracked lips, eyes rimmed with red butt. His expression held something terrifying. Purpose. Tomorrow, he said quietly, Saladin will commit everything. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He simply spoke with certainty, as though reading from a script already written. It is his last chance before we reach the fortified camp at Arsuf. He will attack with his full strength. There was a long silence. Then, one of the knights asked the question they all feared. Can we withstand it, sire? Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the sea, listening to the distant roar of waves against the shore. Finally, he murmured, we will hold, and when the moment comes, we will break them. Some chroniclers swear they saw a faint smile cross his face. Not arrogance, not hope. Something else. Anticipation. Historians still debate it today. Did Richard intentionally slow the march to lure Saladin into overconfidence, into committing everything to a single, decisive attack? If so, it was one of the greatest psychological traps ever set on a medieval battlefield. By dawn, the trap would spring, and both armies would drown in the consequences. Dawn rose on September 7, 1191, not gently, but like a blade drawn from a scabbard, sharp, sudden, merciless. The golden light spilled across the coastal plain of Arsuf, illuminating thousands of armored men who had slept little, bled much, and now waited for either salvation or annihilation. The Crusaders had only 5 miles left until the fortified camp, 5 miles between survival and destruction. But those final miles were the most dangerous, because Richard knew what Saladin knew. This was the last chance to crush the crusade. And so, as the sun edged over the hills, the Muslim host emerged in a dark, rolling tide, tens of thousands of horsemen, their banners snapping like wings of ravens, their drums pounding so violently that men felt the vibrations in their teeth. This was no harassment, this was no probing, this was commitment. Saladin had thrown everything onto the field. The hammer descends. At precisely 9 a.m., the first assault struck. It came not as a test, but as a hammer blow. Thousands of horse archers surged toward the Crusader rear and right flank toward the Hospitallers who had endured the worst of the 7-day march. Arrows darkened the sky. The air filled with a shrill storm of feathered death. Shields rattled. Horses panicked. Men screamed. Dust lifted in choking clouds. The Hospitallers were being torn apart. The Muslim cavalry pressed so close that the Crusaders could see the whites of their enemies' horses' eyes, could hear the rasp of arrows scraping against composite boughs. For 7 days, these knights had been denied the one thing their entire identity was built upon, the charge. They had watched brothers die and done nothing. They had endured insult after insult without striking back. They had swallowed rage until it curdled into something poisonous. Garnier de Nablus, master of the Hospitallers, had reached the end of his endurance. The breaking point, a wave of arrows slammed into the Hospitaller line. One knight toppled with a shaft lodged in his throat. Another's horse collapsed beneath him. The Hospitaller banner dipped, then rose again, splattered with blood. The sight sent a shock through the vanguard. And then Taqi al-Din, Saladin's nephew, led a personal charge toward the Hospitaller standard, a calculated insult, the kind meant to break discipline. It worked. Garnier de Nablus snapped. Accounts differ on his exact words, but all agree on the meaning. I can bear no more. He lowered his lance, spurred his warhorse, and charged. It was the forbidden act, the unthinkable act. The one thing Richard had said must never happen. The Hospitallers saw their commander move and instinct took over. 300 knights hurled themselves forward, screaming oaths of vengeance. In that instant, the entire Crusader army faced annihilation. A premature charge meant death. The formation would disintegrate. The cavalry would be isolated. The infantry would be exposed. The crossbowmen would be slaughtered. The whole army would be split and rolled up like a rug. Richard had seconds 3, maybe to save the crusade. The Lionheart's gamble for a single heartbeat. Witnesses say Richard went still. Then he made the decision that military historians still speak of with reverence. He did not recall the Hospitallers. He did not let them die alone. He did not panic. Instead, he unleashed hell. Richard raised his sword, turned to his trumpeters, and roared, "Now!" To the Hospitallers, "Now!" 3 long blasts shattered the air. It was the sound 12,000 Crusaders had been praying arcing to hear for 7 agonizing days. Every knight, every horse, every muscle that had been coiled in rage exploded into motion at once. The perfect storm the Crusader charge did not form into a frantic mob. Even in their fury, discipline held. Hospitallers formed the right wedge. Templars surged forward on the left. Richard, flanked by English and French knights, led the center, 3 iron triangles cutting through the plain. The ground thundered under 8,000 hooves. Dust rose like a curtain. Sunlight flashed off steel. For the first time in 7 days, the Crusaders were not prey. They were predators. Taqi al-Din's cavalry, so confident moments earlier, suddenly froze. They had never seen a charge like this. Not this coordinated, not this furious, not this inevitable. The psychological shift was immediate. The hunters became the hunted. Impact, where physics becomes murder, A warhorse at full gallop hits with the kinetic force of a modern car crash. When the Crusader line hit, it didn't merely break the Muslim cavalry, it obliterated it. Lances splintered like dry branches, bodies flew, horses screamed, shields buckled. The lighter Muslim cavalry designed for mobility, not shock, stood no chance. Their formation didn't bend, it dissolved. Crusader knights cast aside shattered lances and drew swords, forming a machine of death. Rider above, blade swinging, horse below, kicking and trampling, momentum carrying both forward. The charge had become a storm one Saladin could not stop. The collapse of the wings. On the left, the Templars saw the momentum and struck the Muslim flank with perfect timing. It created a hammer and anvil effect. Templars crushing from one side, Hospitallers from the other. The Muslim right wing shattered. In the center, Richard drove straight into the Mamluk elite. Chroniclers describe him as a giant, a creature of myth, fighting in a rhythm so precise it bordered on divine. His sword rose and fell like a blacksmith's hammer. Around him, his household knights carved a path through Saladin's finest. The Mamluks, men trained from boyhood, feared in every corner of the Islamic world, could not hold. The center broke. Then panic hit the entire Muslim line, sudden, contagious, unstoppable. Warriors who had never fled in their lives now turned their horses away from the unstoppable wave of iron and fury. Saladin's narrow escape for the first time in decades. Saladin's personal banner wavered. He watched as the army he had molded, the army that had conquered Jerusalem, the army that had defeated every Christian force for years, disintegrated in minutes. Eyewitnesses say he seemed frozen, as if unable to comprehend what he was seeing. A third charge, Richard's charge, headed directly for him. His guards dragged him away just before the Crusader wedge could strike. They fled so fast that Saladin's banner was abandoned, left to fall in the dust. A symbol of invincibility, destroyed in less than half an hour. 17 minutes from first impact to total collapse. 17 minutes, 7 days of torment had birthed 17 minutes of annihilation. By the time the dust settled, 7,000 Muslim warriors lay dead. High-ranking emirs were scattered across the field like fallen titans. Mamluk regiments ceased to exist. The Crusaders had lost only 700 men, most before the charge, a 10-to-1 kill ratio, something almost unheard of in medieval warfare. The plain of Arsuf had become a graveyard. The silence of shock when the killing stopped. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Crossbowmen picked off retreating stragglers. Knights wiped blood from their blades in exhausted disbelief. Horses collapsed, their strength spent. For the first time in the entire crusade, the Crusaders felt something beyond anger or suffering. They had broken Saladin, not just his army, not just his battle line, but the myth of his invincibility, and the consequences would echo across the entire Levant. The field of Arsuf was quiet in the way only death can silence a place. Dust drifted over the bodies of men who, moments earlier, had been the pride of Saladin's empire. Horses without riders wandered in aimless, trembling circles. Shields lay cracked and trampled into the earth, and among the fallen, Crusader knights exhausted, armor dented, some still bleeding, stood, staring at the impossible. They had done it. Against every law of medieval warfare, they had destroyed a force over twice their size, in 17 minutes. But the true surprise was not the victory. It was what Richard did next. The victory no one expected, and the decision no one understood. As the last echoes of battle faded, Crusader knights surged forward, shouting for pursuit. Saladin's army was routed, disorganized, fleeing in panic toward the interior. Many of his finest warriors lay dead. His center had evaporated. His guards had dragged him from the field like a man escaping a collapsing fortress. To every knight, the answer was obvious. Ride them down. Finish them. Take Jerusalem now, while nothing stands in the way. Some shouted it openly. Others cried it through cracked lips, barely able to stay upright. Even Richard's closest confidants stared at him with disbelief when he raised his hand not to signal pursuit, but to signal halt. Halt. After a victory like this, after crushing the Sultan's host, too many, it seemed madness. But Richard was not thinking like a knight. He was thinking like a commander holding the last army Christianity had in the Levant. His men were exhausted. Some knights had marched with 6 arrows still embedded in their mail. Horses were blown, their lungs strained, their legs trembling, and the coast was life. The inland was death. A reckless pursuit into unknown terrain could turn triumph into catastrophe. Saladin still had reserves hidden beyond the hills. The Crusader formation, so perfect in its unity, was held together by sheer will. One misstep, one broken line, and the desert would swallow them as it had swallowed countless armies before. Richard sheathed his sword. "We march as planned," he ordered to Arthur. His nobles protested, pleaded, argued. Richard did not waver. Sometimes the only thing harder than charging is stopping. This was one of those times. A shockwave across the Levant, while Richard's knights struggled to accept restraint. The psychological effect of the battle rippled across the Muslim world with terrifying speed. Before Arsuf, the legend of Saladin had seemed untouchable. This was the man who took Jerusalem, who unified Egypt and Syria, who annihilated the Crusader states at Hattin, who had never suffered a defeat in open battle. But now his aura was shattered. In medieval warfare, morale is often worth more than manpower. Men fight with their minds before they fight with their arms. And across the Levant, Saladin's allies and garrisons began to whisper, "If 30,000 could not stop the Franks at Arsuf, who can?" Within days, Jaffa opened its gates without a fight. Ascalon, once defiant, began negotiations. Mediterranean coastal cities, so vital to Saladin's supply lines, wavered in loyalty. An empire that had swept through the Holy Land like a desert storm now found itself shaken. Even Saladin's own emirs began questioning. Mamluk officers murmured about the Sultan's decisions. In private councils, doubts spread like cracks through stone. The myth of invincibility had died harder than the men who had believed it. The cost of losing elites. When historical texts mention 7,000 dead, the number alone does not capture the reality. These weren't peasant levies. These were elite warriors, Mamluks, trained from childhood. Men who cost fortunes to equip, men whose experience could not be replaced in a decade. Each emir who fell commanded not just troops, but extended households, networks, loyalty chains. Their deaths fractured entire military structures. Saladin hadn't just lost a battle. He had lost a generation of leadership. This loss would shadow the rest of the war. The battle that rewrote medieval doctrine. For centuries, military tacticians believed lighter, mobile forces could always defeat heavier cavalry through attrition. Hattin, among other battles, seemed to prove that, but Arsuf overturned that doctrine completely. Richard had shown that heavy cavalry, properly disciplined, could become an unstoppable shock weapon. Infantry and crossbows supporting cavalry created a synergistic force far deadlier than knights charging alone. Patience could be weaponized, turning suffering into a trap. This wasn't just a victory of force, it was a victory of method. European armies would study these principles for centuries. From French cavalry doctrines to English combined arms, tactics to Napoleonic operational planning. Even in modern warfare, the concept remained. Endure the early blows, lure your enemy in. Make them believe you're breaking, then strike with concentrated force. From Waterloo to Desert Storm, the echoes of Arsuf can be heard. Saladin's wound that never healed. Saladin was not shattered as a leader, he remained respected, even revered. But something fundamental had changed. He would never again face Crusader knights in open field. He became cautious, defensive, strategic rather than bold. The memory of Arsuf haunted him. In subsequent encounters, Muslim cavalry once fearless showed hesitation. They held back, thinking of the charge that had crushed them. Psychological wounds run deeper than physical ones, and at Arsuf, the wound was profound. The Sultan who once swept across the Levant now avoided decisive clashes. The war shifted into sieges, negotiations, maneuvering. Arsuf had not won Jerusalem for Richard, but it had forced Saladin to fight on Richard's terms. The genius of restraint. Many chronicles criticize Richard for not pursuing the routed Muslim army. Had he pushed, they argue, he might have captured Saladin, seized Jerusalem, ended the war, but that misunderstands the man and the moment. Richard's genius wasn't merely in timing the charge, it was in knowing when not to fight. That is something almost no medieval commander ever mastered. Pursuing an enemy who feigned rout was a classic trap of Eastern warfare. Saladin had used it many times. Richard would not fall for it, not even with victory at his fingertips. Discipline had won the day. Lack of discipline could still lose everything. So the Lionheart made the hardest decision of all. He preserved his army. The capture of Jaffa soon followed. The road toward Jerusalem became a negotiation rather than a desperate siege, and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land stabilized rather than collapsed. He had shifted the war from crisis to leverage. That was the real victory. The 7 days that made 17 minutes possible. When history remembers Arsuf, it tends to remember the charge. But every knight who knelt at sunset on September 7th understood a deeper truth. The victory was bought on the road, not on the battlefield. 7 days of blistering heat, 7 days of unrelenting arrows, 7 days of thirst, rage, restraint, 7 days of discipline that should have shattered the charge was merely the release. The march was the test. It was endurance not strength that won Arsuf, patience not ferocity that destroyed Saladin's army, and discipline not numbers that changed the course of the crusade. Legacy. As night fell over the blood-soaked plain, Richard's knights collapsed where they stood. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared at the darkening horizon with hollow eyes. They had survived hell. They had broken an empire's confidence. They had changed the balance of the Holy Land. And yet, the war was far from over. Saladin still held Jerusalem. Richard still aimed for it. And the next phase would be fought with minds as much as swords. But one truth had been etched into history. 12,000 men had crushed 30,000 not through strength, but through discipline. Not through speed, but through patience. Not through luck, but through the perfect moment to unleash hell. And for 17 unforgettable minutes, Richard the Lionheart showed the world what happens when suffering becomes strategy.